He's also changed how I teach business. My two favorite courses are leadership and strategy, which I think most companies have the hardest times with.
Indeed.
And I use Xi Jinping as models for both leadership and strategy. And I was just amazed to see the efforts they go through to make sure every child has an opportunity for education. They really went to each household and encouraged the parents and the children to understand why this is important.
Welcome aboard a journey through time at the Chat Lounge.
China's education system has seen remarkable transformation over the past 7 decades. Official data reveals that the average years of schooling for Chinese people has surged to 11 years, a significant jump from just 1.6 years back in 1949. So, how did China manage to build the world's largest education system? What key reforms have helped this populous nation shift from quantity to quality in terms of human resources? And now, as socialism with Chinese characteristics enters a new era, how should the country tackle challenges such as the gap between people's increasing demand for quality education and its unbalanced development? Hello and welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Xu Yawen. In the 4th episode of our series commemorating the 75 years of the People's Republic of China, we talked to Professor William Brown, who's been teaching the MBA program at Xiamen University for more than 3 decades. Professor Brown, it's such an honor to have you today. Over the past 30 years, you've been living and working here in China, and you hold many titles, including a scholar at Xiamen University, a host of the local TV, and also author of over 20 books. I think the most impressive one would be the first foreigner who received the permanent residence in Fujian province. More than that, you have many awards as well. So among all of those impressive experiences, which one is your favorite?
The most popular was the 2019 Moving China. That was very moving. But the one that means the most to me is 2 combined. One, the permanent residence in '92. That was very important to me because that showed my students, who I was trying to encourage that the future is here, not abroad, that showed them I'm here to stay. This is my home. But then 2001, Xi Jinping gave me, he was our governor, and in Fuzhou he gave me honorary citizen of Fujian. He even gave me 500 business cards with that on there. And that was really a great honor for me because I already had permanent residence, but this showed I wasn't just a permanent resident foreigner, I'm a citizen. So.
Well, speaking of those interactions with President Xi, I recall that you once said that your interactions with him dated back to 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And his words or his interactions with you sort of changed the life for you twice. So what have happened? Could you share with us the stories?
Yeah, well, the thing is, I really admire Xi Jinping in the early 90s because he was a young leader and he really suffered when he was a youth, but he struggled and kept going. And even from his teens, he's very innovative and trying to fight poverty where he was. And then Zhengding, very creative. And then Ningde, one of the poorest 18 counties in China, in just 2 years brought about great changes there. And then in the 90s, while he was just a Fujian leader, he went to Ningxia, one of the poorest areas, and just later, those things he did as a youth now are practiced as policies all over China because they were so insightful. But still, I didn't have a real deep impression of him because he's so low-key. We see him in meetings in Fuzhou, in the meetings, but he didn't talk much. And he's low-key. I found out he listened to everything. But he didn't talk much unless he really understood the situation and researched and had something to say. Then he said what he thought. But what really first gave me a deep impression was in '99, I had to go to Hong Kong. I was going to be there in the hospital 6 days, and they found out I had cancer and 2 surgeries, and it just got worse and worse. I was there 2 months, and Xi Jinping found out. And, I don't know why he really cared that much, because I'm not a rich investor or businessman or anything. I'm just a common teacher. But he sent 2 people to the Hong Kong hospital with flowers, saying, I hope you get well and come home soon. Others had asked me if I get well, am I going back home? They meant U.S. I didn't want to go back to U.S. I wanted to go back to Fujian, Xiamen. So I was so moved by that, and that really touched my heart. And then 2 years later, in 2001, he gave me honorary citizen of Fujian, and that was. But then he changed my direction again because that night at dinner, he said, China understands the world more now, but the world still doesn't understand China. We need to tell China's story better. And then he said, you wrote a book about Xiamen, your second home. You should write about Chunzhou, your third home. I said, I didn't know Chunzhou was my third home. But he knew I'd been there dozens of times because that's the start of the Maritime Silk Road, and I think that gave him the idea for Belt and Road. I wasn't really keen on writing another book. Just 2 textbooks and Xiamen book, that was enough. But I finally wrote the Chunzhou book when I helped them a year later on a project. And when I learned about the history of Chunzhou and the Maritime Silk Road and in Fujian, it's incredible. I thought, wow, I had no idea. So I wrote that book, and then I wrote another and another and another and another. And so if he hadn't encouraged me, I wouldn't have written more books about China, probably. But then he really moved my heart again, because in 2019, I sent him my latest book about our family in China, Off the Wall, How We Fell for China.
Yeah.
And I mailed him the book and a letter thanking him for encouraging me to write. I never imagined he'd receive the book, but I really never imagined he'd reply. And not only that, he sent 2 of his books. I gave him my book, he sent 2. And in the letter, he wrote that he knew I'd write even better stories in the future. And I thought, well, that's Xi Jinping. He said, it doesn't matter how many I've already written. He's saying, keep writing, because we have to keep telling China's story. But that was very moving. But then just after that, they had the annual Congress. And by the way, since he wrote that letter, I've published, I think, 10 more books. After that, they had the annual Congress. And the Fujian delegation was with Xi Jinping for a very brief time. But during that brief time, this is 20 years after I had cancer in Hong Kong. 20 years later, he asked the Fujian delegates, he said, how is Bill Brown? Is he retired? How is his health? I just was, when they came back and shared that, I was, oh my goodness, 20 years later.
He still remembered.
He remembered and he cared. But I've been to every place he's been. I've been to Lanzhou, where he was as a teen and really suffering. I've been to Zhengding, where he was a young leader. And people everywhere say that he remembers people. Decades later, he visits, remembers them, remembers their family, remembers their problems he's facing. Even with me, he asked if we had family problems or any difficulties in our lives. And I didn't want to say, he's a governor, but I told him, and he thought about it and gave me very wise advice. And so he's a very people person. So he's also changed how I teach business. My 2 favorite courses are leadership and strategy, which I think most companies have the hardest times with.
Indeed.
And I use Xi Jinping as models for both leadership and strategy.
So it can both implied in the governance, a country's governance, and also in running a business.
Yeah, because, well, my students were surprised the first time I said, in my eyes, New China's greatest entrepreneur, Xi Jinping. Why? Because even as a teen in Lanzhou, he helped them overcome a lot of difficulties, very creative. And in Zhengding, and in Xiamen, Ningde, he helped start a lot of companies to fight poverty. But he never started one for himself. He never made money for himself. So he's a great entrepreneur. So I really admire him. So I use him in many of my lectures. I give examples of what he did as a leader, as a communicator, or as an entrepreneur. So big influence on my life.
You just mentioned about writing textbooks for the Xiamen University's MBA programs. So if we zoom into the education sector, which you have been in for more than 30 years now, how was it look like 30 years ago when you firstly taught MBA courses versus today? Any reforms and changes that you have observed through lecturing students?
Well, for MBA specifically, when I first started teaching MBA, my students were all right out of college. So they were 21, 22. They had no life experience. They'd been students all their lives. And so they came into MBA program, and a lot of them really thought that they graduate from MBA, they're going to be CEOs of companies. I mean, they didn't know they still had to work their way up. And they were kind of naive. And I also felt they had no creativity. My goodness, it was because Chinese education system at that time, they just want you to tell them everything. And I would try to get them to use some creativity, business cases. I'd give them A and C, and they tell me what is B. And actually, I'm surprised to learn, Confucius was very creative in his teaching. I mean, I love one of his sayings is he said, if I show you one corner and you cannot deduce the other 3 corners, I'm not going to keep teaching you. But in the early 90s, I felt I could show my students 3 corners and they still couldn't figure out the 4th corner.
Really?
Really. Later, I found out they really did have creativity. But they just, it's suppressed through education, but the whole world has the same thing. But later, when they graduated, they went into business and government, and they faced opportunities or faced obstacles, found out they were very creative and very successful. Now I meet my students all over, even flying here to Beijing. The guy beside me, I attended one of my lectures 20 years ago, and the girl in front was a former student. And this is something, though, today the students are older because China passed a rule that you must have 3 years business experience or work experience to go into MBA. And this is great because, like in Europe, US doesn't have this, but in Europe, most of the universities expect MBA students to have a minimum of
some working experience.
Work experience, and it's practical. Because back then they didn't see the practical use of what we taught. Today my students are business people, government leaders, entrepreneurs, and when I teach a class they say, yeah, I face this problem. This is, or when I teach some way about doing it, and they say, yeah, but I also had this problem, I did it a different way. So today the students are more experienced, a lot more fun to teach. But I must say those students 30-something years ago were very diligent.
This is Chat Lounge. Coming up next, we will look at measures China has taken to improve its people's education level. Stay with us.
I cannot marry you, while your mother regards me.
Step into the world of timeless elegance with Mrs. Spring Fragrance, a captivating audiobook by Edith Eaton, read by Man Ling.
Because the green leaf still clings to the bough.
Experience the lively yet complex lives in Chinese American communities at the turn of the 20th century as Edith Eaton's delicate prose weaves together themes of tradition, change, love, and identity.
Forget all that belongs to the joy of life.
Follow the journey of Mrs. Spring Fragrance and witness the struggles and fights of those living on a rapidly changing exotic land while holding on to their cultural traditions, or more importantly, to their identities.
He could hardly believe that his daughter was seriously opposed to becoming the wife of such a good-looking, prosperous young merchant as Wang Ling.
Join Books and Beyond for Mrs. Spring Fragrance. Let the stories come to life in your imagination. Subscribe to Books and Beyond for free on your favorite podcast platforms, or log on to radio.cgtn.com for more.
Welcome back. We continue our discussion on China's education reform with Professor William Brown. Over the past 7 decades, the average years of education per person has increased from 1.6 years in 1949, that's when China was established, to today, last year, to 11 years. Look at the dramatic increase of how many years an average person could receive education nowadays. So from a micro perspective, how do you view the efforts that the Chinese government have done in order to improve the education level to everyone in this country? What efforts have the government done to change that?
Well, this is truly amazing to me. 30 years ago they said roads first, then riches. But the key to using those roads is education. Like I went to Yongchun, to a poor area with some students of mine, and the farmer there, he had won awards for his tea, but he had to sell it so cheaply he couldn't make any money, and because he didn't know how to market or how to get a label or anything, or a lot of the different things. So the students formed a team to help him, and now he's done much better the past 2 years. But the education is fundamental if poor people want to succeed. But what amazes me is how China at every step of the level, because before education, the most basic thing is health. They've researched this around the world as well as in China. If the people are unhealthy, that's going to affect their mental and psychological development, social development, emotional development, affect their educational abilities. So China very early focused on early childhood development and made a vast improvement in this. Children healthier, then they do better in studies. And then the early childhood education, which UNESCO also emphasizes, early childhood education. And they did some research on this, and I think it was early childhood development in the poorest areas was something, they got a score of 71%, in the most developed areas, 82%. That's not a terribly big difference in such a big country. So they've done well at this. So first of all, starting with this is very basic. childhood development. But then the government, they have the macro policy of mandatory 9 years education, but how do you get from the macro down to the local village level, household level? And this is amazing. I visited the Lisu minority in Sichuan, Yunnan, very remote area. And I talked with the leaders there and the people, Lisu people, and I was just amazed to see the efforts they go through to make sure every child has an opportunity for education. I mean, they can't make them study. I mean, let's face it, if China made children study, the other countries would complain you're violating their rights. But then if they don't study, then they don't have much opportunity, and then they complain they don't have opportunity. But there, they really went to each household and encouraged the parents and the children to understand why this is important. And then, if a child dropped out before the 9-year mandatory, some of them went to big cities to work at 15 years old, 14 years old. So they actually went to these cities, flew to these cities to find the children, persuade them to return. I mean, what kind of government does that? And in Tibet, at the 5,000-meter death zone, even there, a lot of their children didn't want to study. The parents didn't want them to study. They wanted them to work. And the children didn't see the point of study. But they put a lot of effort there, Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, to help them understand why education is important, even for poor people in remote areas. And so the policies are amazing, the macro policies, but what really amazes me is how they go down to the city, village, household level. It's just something I don't think any other country does.
You helped us understand the significance of education for general public, especially for people from remote areas. So how do you think that has support or boost China's rapid economic growth?
Well, first thing is, they've done research on this to show what is the effect of education level on a country's development. And the highest GDPs in the world, those countries also just happen to be the highest education development. And I don't think it's because they're rich, therefore education is better. I think it's because they're more educated, and therefore they develop better, more prosperous, because these people know how to do things. I mean, let's look, for example, at Chinese in other countries. They generally do better than the people around them. Why? Because they emphasize education. I have a book from 1861 written by a foreigner in Fuzhou, 1861. And he said, in 1861, he said, Chinese have never conquered, but they do colonize. He said they're in every Asian country. And in every country that they're in, they almost monopolize every very profitable business. But how? Not through like the other countries controlling everything. He said through their superior civilization, their intellect, their capacity for business, and their hard work. And he said because of this, he said the commerce passes into their hands. They don't seize it. It passes into their hands. They become the leading spirits of the countries they live in, leading spirits. And like Chinese, even 100 years ago, they started Xiamen University. They use that money then to help these other countries develop. Like Belt and Road today, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, Chinese and other countries were helping to build roads, schools, hospitals. So this education is, Chinese did this because of education. So this education is very fundamental to China's development. But that doesn't mean everybody becomes a university graduate, everybody becomes a professor or some high-level position, but it's just fundamental.
Once they're educated, they have options, more options of what they want to do, and find their own habits or interest, the thing that they want to do, and pursue for that goal.
Yeah, one good example is Xiamen University's first Tibetan student, Yishi Danzeng, is my hero. The young guy didn't learn Chinese till he was 13. In America, my hometown of the United States, we boast that we don't have a national language. But how many do you think first-generation migrants there would be happy if their children didn't learn English? Because if a first-generation migrant in the U.S. children don't learn English, they're just going to be farm workers or factory workers or something. They have no future. So first-generation immigrants in the U.S. really make sure their children learn English. So we can say there's no common language, but if children don't learn English, they have no future. Same in China. Yishi Danzeng didn't learn Chinese till he was 13. And some people comment how the older Tibetans, they make them learn Chinese. They don't make them learn it, but if they don't learn it, it's just like U.S. or any other country, France, Germany.
They don't get the point there.
They don't get the point.
Yeah.
So I'm just happy that these children aren't forced to do anything, but they're given the opportunity if they take it. But it's the same as all the world over. We can't make people do things. But it's like 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, if a child in a remote area wants to succeed, there are ways to do it.
Although today, over 99% of school-aged children have received universal 9-year basic education. I mean, there are still challenges that need to be addressed in China's education system. We have to admit that. And for instance, educational equality, as we have briefly touched upon this, but we can elaborate more on that. If you have ever heard about stories like this, and this is something I've learned from a professor from Peking University, one of the most elite university in China. And he said that in the past, many students at Peking University came from impoverished families because educational resources were more evenly distributed across the nation. And there were very good middle or high schools in the county level compared to today. And he said nowadays it's harder for students from impoverished families to get into elite universities like the Peking University. So what are your thoughts on this, your observation on this? How likely is it for children from rural areas to rise to prominence?
Well, this is a complicated question. I think it was more evenly distributed 30, 40 years ago, because 30, 40 years ago, everyone was poor. And then the coastal areas have developed faster. I mean, it's a fact, even though the remote areas have improved. I mean, it's just a fact that coastal areas, big cities, have improved faster, and they have more opportunities. But this is not just a problem of China. I mean, this is a problem of all the world. So these remote areas have challenges. But that's the same, for example, in the U.S. You can go to a school in a big city, and you can go to another county in a more rural area in a smaller school, and it's not as good at education. So if you go to a school like that in a small county in the United States and it's not as good at education, you're probably not likely to test into Harvard University or Yale. So this is surely a challenge. But the government's put such efforts into this. And here's one other problem, is the first Tibetan student shared this with me. You go to the really poor areas, one reason the education quality is low is it's hard to, no matter what the policy, it's hard to get really good teachers to go to the really poor areas. And in Tibet, in Xinjiang, some of the areas I know, it's hard to get the local people, so a lot of the really good teachers are Han Chinese teachers who volunteered to go to those poor areas. But when they give the education to the children in the remote Tibetan Valley or in North Xinjiang or Inner Mongolia, they get the education and they become a teacher. They want to go to the bigger cities or other provinces where they can make more money. So it's really challenging to get the local people, once they prosper, to stay and serve their own people, like the Tibetan student I know did. So they have special programs. The government has tried many creative things to give them special policies, special benefits if they will stay and teach, give them special education benefits for their education, give Chinese teachers from other areas special programs to encourage them to go to these poor areas. And then a lot of volunteer programs. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands probably they say the first secretaries volunteering for 3 years to go to the poorest areas. I call them barefoot secretary. That's my phrase for it, because 50 years ago we had barefoot doctors serving the poorest people, living with them. Today, I've talked to these first secretaries all over China living with the poorest people. I call them barefoot secretaries. And these are some of the people that help reach these poor students. So it's a fact that these remoter areas, whatever country, it's not going to be completely equal. But with these volunteers, with all these programs to improve the opportunities, so there's so many different things they're doing to try to solve this problem. When I was in Beijing a few years ago, I talked to a teenage girl here, and she said 2 nights a week she spends time online tutoring rural children in math. And she said, our family is not rich, but we're better off than those rural children. I was very moved by that, but I was also encouraged because these rural children who are poor could study online, so they had computers and internet.
That's really, really nice.
So this is a great equalizer, and the poor, even Mount Everest has 5G. It's amazing.
So nowadays, as long as there are internet students,
that's a great equalizer.
Yes, it will help to solve those problems.
Yeah, I know many people that got degrees from Harvard online, almost all online, the last maybe semester. But it's amazing the online opportunities in China.
This is Chat Lounge. When we come back, we will delve into the challenges China faces in its education sector. Stay with us.
The strong wind was howling and whistling.
He was the first Chinese citizen to graduate from Yale University in the mid-19th century.
I was born on the 17th of November. She had prominent features. 3 of us were old enough to lend a helping hand.
He navigated between two vastly different cultures and moved further to realize his dream and promote understanding between the people of China and the United States.
Ye Mingxing was a native of Hanyang. I realized no danger. China is really awakening.
Come and join us in discovering the incredible journey of Xu Yawen in his autobiography, My Life in China and America. Check out the Audible stories on radio.cgtn.com and all major podcast platforms. Just search for the podcast Books and Beyond and find My Life in China and America.
Welcome back. We continue our discussion on the challenges facing China's education sector with Professor William Brown. I want to touch upon this children who were left behind because of their parents migrant to other places for better job opportunities and left them with their grandparents or other relatives. Is what we call left behind children. Even though, we have internet access nowadays and open courses online, still without parents staying with their children, it could be very distracting for their kids, especially when it comes to education sector. So how can we ensure that every single child receives the education they needed? What has been done by the Chinese authorities and what more needs to be done?
Okay, to ensure that every child gets such an education is really hard. I think for any country, in theory, yes, but in practice. But I think China has done the most possible to ensure this. Like I mentioned, going to that very remote valley in the Lisu minority there, where they go to household, talking to the families. Because a lot of the people that don't have the education in China, it's not because they don't have the opportunity, it's because the parents want them to work in the countryside. Or the children don't see the point of getting an education because they don't know what an education is for. In my own family, I'm the first person in my family to get a college degree, and they didn't see the point of it. I got 4 degrees, and they still didn't see the point of it. So they're going house to house, family to family, discussing with them, explaining why this is important for you. Why it's important for your child. If you don't do it, you want them the rest of their life to be just work in the fields, work in the farms, and that's all the future they'll have. So this is changing, but also the media is helping. I remember when I took 12 foreigners in my van to Ningda to show in 2005, drove there, took 8 hours to get there at that time, and we walked 8 hours into the mountains with packs and spent the night in tents. I wanted them to see one of the remotest villages. In the remotest villages, they had everything they had internet, they had, not internet, but they had telephone service, they had TV because they had satellite on the roof. But the one thing that they didn't have was people in their 20s or 30s or 40s because these people had gone to Shanghai, Pudong because they saw TV and they wanted to prosper like other people did sing. So all they had was young children and the grandparents there. But this is the thing, the left behind children. What can they do with these left behind children? The actual practice of grandparents taking care of children is pretty good, I think. If you do it consistently over generations, grandparents, I know many grandparents taking care of the children, here in Beijing even. The grandparents are retired, they're happy to take care of the grandchildren, they do a good job of it, and that frees the parents to work. So China has really emphasized with one of the many programs is kindergarten development and built hundreds of thousands of kindergartens and private and government sponsored and required that these kindergartens meet government standards. And then this helps prepare the children for later education and helps motivate them for education, because once you give them a taste of learning, even as in kindergarten, you give them a taste of learning, it helps give them maybe a desire to study and learn more. I think kindergarten is very powerful. My sister went, I didn't go. Someday I want to go to kindergarten. So it's many policies that they're doing across the country to get these children into school. But it's very challenging. And again, I can give you stories of problems and stories of failure. But I think I can give many more stories of success. So the big thing about China is that it's very systematic, from the national level to regional level, provincial level, county level. city level, village level, down to the household. It's absolutely incredible, the emphasis they put on education. And the other thing is that since 49, but especially in the 36 years I've been here, the policies and practices continue to improve, continue. And they see these problems. I was very critical in my early years of some things I saw. But then I learned more about the policies and practices and saw step by step they continue to improve. So China's already far ahead of any other country I know of, but it's not resting on what it's done. It continues to improve.
Yeah, like every year during the two sessions.
Every year in the two sessions.
Delegations and they will gather together and brought up those issues and discussed and draft a law and eventually passed it and implement those.
Yeah, some people asked me, said, what do you think was surprising about any surprises about the last congressional meeting? I said, well, for me, the greatest thing and the biggest surprise is that there's not usually big surprises because it's not like some countries where they have a radical departure to try and please the people and get votes. The Congress makes the changes based on the problems and opportunities they face, and those are evolving over time. And they build upon the successes and they solve the problems. And so each year basically is a review of what went well and what didn't go so well the previous year, and they build on it. So you can pretty much usually kind of guess what they're going to talk about in the next Congress because it's logical, it's systematic. By the way, this is not new either. I call this, I term barefoot secretary, but I also term China's fifth great invention. Do you know what that is? 300 years ago, English politician Eustace Budgell said, 300 years ago, 1731, he said, the whole world knows about China's four great inventions.
Yes.
But what is universally acknowledged by all nations, China is greatest at the art of government. Art of government. So I call that China's fifth great invention. About 300 years ago, Jesuit missionaries translated Chinese classics into European languages, and that kind of helped spark the Enlightenment. And many Europeans, like famous Europeans, recommended to European governments to learn from Chinese government and to adapt Chinese government policies and practices because they were tired of medieval governments run by monarchs who inherited their positions and all that. And the European leaders, of course, didn't like that, threatened some of them to stop talking about China. So that was 300 years ago. They talked about China's art of government. And that's what we have today. The art of government is basically systematic government built on a foundation of people who are educated and who can use their education, intellectual ability to see problems and solve it. And China had to do this because 2,000 years ago, 2 AD, China had almost 60 million people. This is 2,000 years ago, almost 60 million people. You can't just run a country slipshod with 60 million people. So today we see the same thing. The government, each year, each Congress systematically analyzes what's happening.
This is A Journey Through Time, a special series dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China.
If we come back to modern times and look at the current education system, especially we hear this term very often, the happy education model. I mean, it's originated in the US and other Western developed nations, but is adopted by China in recent years. How do you understand this happy education?
I understand the point, but also, if you go too far with a happy education, are they going to be happy later with their life if they don't know what they're doing? When I first came here, my son started in Chinese schools, and I didn't like the rigidity. I finally ended up having them study correspondence plus Chinese tutors, and they did well in both the Chinese and all. But when my children were 7, I built a treehouse. 6, I built a treehouse for them to play in. And I remember the neighbors complaining. They said, "You're wasting money because in 10 years they'll be gone to college." Well, 10 years, they're children now. And they said, well, if they play now,
Did you build it at Xiamen University?
Xiamen University. I built it on the campus.
Wow.
And I built a treehouse and a slide. When I first built a treehouse, they said, well, what are you doing up there? I said, I'm building a treehouse. They said, why? I said, because when my wife is angry, I can sleep here. Within one day, everyone in campus knew my wife was very strict and she got angry. But I built a treehouse and a slide. One of the slides is still there. But they said, wow, if you build this, the children won't study and it's going to hurt their university. And I said, they're 6 years old. And my piano teacher is a professor. My children's piano teacher was a professor of piano, She had a 7-year-old son. I said, do you teach your son piano? She said, oh, I don't dare, because 7 years old, it might affect his college entrance exams preparation. 7 years old. I said, this is too much. So I understand that's gone too far, but the government, even in the 90s, was trying to find a way to balance this. Parents complain about the pressure on the children, but then when they try to change, if they give them more free time, then of course their test scores will go down, and then they complain their test scores go down. So how do you fix this? And it's not just a problem in China, all of Asia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore. So this is something that needs to be addressed, but it's something China's been trying to work on for 30 years. It's not an easy thing. But I think one problem is that we've created unrealistic expectations. One, this idea of everybody should have a college education, everybody should test into college, and pressure to get into college. Is that
for Chinese people, probably they think most of the time, they think this is the only way out,
the only way
out. To be successful.
Yeah, and 100 years ago, foreigners wrote that Chinese believe that education's, but realistically, if so many people get a college education, like in the U.S. now, how many in the U.S. get a college education but then can't get a job?
Actually, surprisingly, not everyone. I mean, because I spent 7 years in America, and like from my understanding, a lot of kids, college is not their priority.
Yeah.
They probably will take gap year and to find out what they want to do, and then later on they find, because it's expensive.
Yeah,
and also
expensive.
It takes a lot of time. You have to pay for it because it's not like in China, it's affordable.
Yeah.
The tuition fees in America is very high. So in America, it's not everyone's option. But here in China, it seems like everyone will think that's their goal before they turn 18.
Yeah, to get to university. One other thing about that too is criticized that it crushed children's creativity. I wrote an article about that 3 decades ago called When Silence is Not Golden, because I couldn't get my students to think creatively. But the one thing that this unhappy education does is, like the Chinese system 1,000 years ago, it does create a foundation, academic foundation. And they've researched this. America talks about how their happy education creates more creative children. We don't teach them knowledge, we teach them how to learn. But the fact is, after school, they don't learn. Most Americans, adults, don't read books, especially now with the internet. And they're not creative. In America, they researched 1,600 children, or 16,000 children. And from age 3 to 5, they were tested as creative geniuses. 98% creative genius. That means we're born creative. But by age 7, they learn to feel failure, don't give the wrong answer in school. I remember first grade when I was 6 years old, reading a sentence, enug, instead of enough, and I was so embarrassed and didn't want to open my mouth again. By age 25, 200,000 Americans, 2% were creative genius. So it went from 98% to 2% in a country that says they boost creativity. The problem is that it doesn't boost creativity, but they also don't have the academic foundation. And in America, a large percentage of workers have to have remedial training just to read well enough to do their jobs. So this unhappy education, the happy education, I understand why they do it. But if they don't have a solid foundation, academic foundation, they're not going to have much of a future. But I think that maybe the idea is misplaced that they push everybody to go to college. This is where some alternatives to college need to come in.
Well, speaking of that, actually, it leads to my next question. You probably have already heard about this. Another major reform in China's education sector is increasing the proportion of vocational education. So it aims to solve the problem of college graduates having degrees but lacking solid skills.
Yeah.
And also, it hopes to promote entrepreneurship and also more job opportunities and employment. However, this shift means that the high school entrance exams will be more challenging. And under this context, it could lead to around 30 to 40% of students at age 15 or 16 only be able to attend vocational schools after middle school. However, they can still later apply to the full-year universities with specific majors. So with that background, do you believe this is the right direction for the country to reform, to have as many as 30 to 40% of its students go to the vocational schools?
Well, it doesn't sound so good, but from my own perspective, my own experience, I think this is a great direction. again, what is the point of a child pushing themselves for a college degree in something that they won't use or won't help them get a job? And when I was young, I didn't plan to get a college degree. I joined the military. One reason is because they let me study for free while I was in the military and then pay for 4 years college afterwards. And my whole 7 years in the military, I took so many courses. But I didn't have a plan for a degree. I just studied what was interesting. I studied oceanography, astronomy, psychology. I studied everything until one of the leaders' counselor once said to me, if you just focused in one direction, you could get a degree. I said, I don't care about a degree. I just love to learn. And she said, well, you'll make more money. I said, I'll do it. And I finished my BA in 13 months, and I'm very motivated. Wow. But and then, of course, I got excited. It's like Xi Jinping encouraged me to write books. I couldn't stop. Once I started learning, then I was hooked and kept learning. But before that, I also took a lot of vocational courses while I was in the military. I studied photography and locksmithing and just different skills. One, I was curious to learn how, but two, when I get out, what will I do? And I think that this vocational education is very important because a lot of people go to vocational school, they graduate, they make more than some college graduates.
That's true.
And they're doing something that they have a skill, because vocational education gives you an actual marketable skill. That's not just good for marketing yourself, it's something you feel proud of being able to do. You're an expert, you can do something, you don't just have head knowledge that you can never use. So I think it gives them a marketable skill, gives them a sense of self-esteem, but then, like me, you eventually learn what you're really interested in, and then go to college. So I later went to college, and I started out police science and criminal justice because of my military training, and then cross-cultural studies, because that's my real love, and then business degree because I was in business, and I thought if China wants to peacefully develop, they need to learn business, so I thought it might be useful. But it took me a time to learn what I really wanted to do, and I'm glad I didn't push myself to focus on one thing that I didn't like. My youngest son, Matthew, by the way, he changed majors 3 times. Completely different. My wife was very angry because he spent more time and cost money, but I said I'd rather he not push himself to get a degree now in something he's not sure he'll like. I don't want him to spend his life doing something he doesn't enjoy. So he started out piano, did well, switched to computers, did well, and finally did medicine, and now he's with his wife do volunteer medical work in Africa, which I really admire. And he loves that. And again, it's skills and feeling.
This is Chat Lounge. Let's take a short break. Coming back, we will continue our discussion with Professor William Brown.
"75 years ago, a new chapter in history began, a momentous journey of resilience, innovation, and unity. This year, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Join us for a special series as we speak to renowned politicians, economists, and senior officials of international organizations about their personal experiences and views on the events that have defined modern China. From the triumphs of the past to the promises of tomorrow, we'll explore the milestones, challenges, and remarkable progress that have made China a global power that continues to shape the international stage. Subscribe to the Chat Lounge for the 75 years of China's rise on your favorite podcast platform as we commemorate this unforgettable journey.
Welcome back. Let's continue our discussion with Professor William Brown from Xiamen University. I agree with what you have just said, but I think there are some concerns here because in China, parents would think, including students, like the general public would have this stereotype thinking that vocational schools means your kids are not good enough to go to college, or you'll be lower level class in the society.
Yeah,
I think
that's the reality.
Does it happen in the Western countries, like in the US, or what's the
It is a reality.
solution to this kind of stereotypical thinking?
It's a reality in China. It also, you see it in the US to some extent. I mean, in the US, it seems like college graduates seem to be higher than others. Not maybe not as much as 30, 40 years ago, because now so many people have a college degree and don't do so well with it. But I remember in the military, I was so frustrated in the military because the leaders, a lot of the leaders were 21 years old, right out of college, and because they finished college, they immediately become a leader. And I thought they were ignorant and arrogant, and they were, a lot of them. So we have that bias, and in China it's especially strong because throughout Chinese history, Chinese have emphasized education as the one road to success. But that doesn't change the reality. Chinese parents are just going to have to say, I don't know if it'll happen or not, but Chinese parents need to accept the fact that not all children are going to go to college. It's not necessarily the best thing to go to college. And are they going to destroy their children over it by giving them unreasonable expectations? I know children who have been pressured by their parents to get into college, and they did it, and it destroyed them emotionally and really had problems, and they got into degrees and careers that they hate, but they stay in them because they're parents.
That's a good point, because it happens a lot.
A lot. I've seen it.
Yes, like it happened on me as well. Like I'm just one of the many cases, but I'm glad that I figured out what I want to do when I was in high school. But for many Chinese students, even adults nowadays, back then when they have the option, or when they were trying to study very hard at school and trying to get into a very great universities, they actually don't know what they're interested in doing, what they want to pursue in life.
I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up.
So I guess the point here is you'd better figure out what you want to do in a very early age. Regardless, you want to go to universities and then get your master degrees or PhDs to become a doctor, or you want to, become a chef, a very well-known, outstanding chef in your industry. Like, it doesn't matter what you do, but it's more like you want to figure out what you want to do. And then you pursue your goal.
Pursue your dream. Don't forget your dream. I met a 30-year-old PhD student just a few months ago, and she told me she's getting her PhD in a career she totally doesn't like. 30 years old, but she's doing it because her parents pushed her through her bachelor's degree, her master's degree, and now her PhD because of her parents. 30 years old. It's hard for me to imagine. So this is not a symptom of Chinese government's failure. This is a symptom of a problem that's all over the world probably, but especially in China. So I admire that, and I think gradually maybe this can change, because as people understand better the role of vocational education and don't see it as a stigma, as somebody who couldn't get into college, but somebody that's doing something they really like or love, and it could even be temporary until they do something else. If people slowly, parents and everyone else slowly see the reality of this and why this is real life, we can't set such high, unreasonable expectations. I think it can gradually change, but it's going to take a lot of education of the parents, education of the people.
You probably know that the recently concluded the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China released this resolution. It outlines the plan for the country to deepen comprehensive reform in education. And this includes a wide range of details, such as creating world-class universities, better distributing educational resources, and expanding free education, and also promoting high-standard opening up in the education sector by encouraging top foreign universities in science and engineering to establish programs in China. So how do you interpret China's commitment to deepening comprehensive reform in education sector?
Well, two things. One, as I said earlier, I mean, it's just a fact that the countries with the highest GDP have the highest education. So if you improve the education, that will improve China in probably all levels. But in this comprehensive reform of education, again, fifth grade invention, China is systematic. So China has been systematically changing since '49, learning and evolving over time. But this is such a big change and so complex and holistic. I think it's probably beyond any one person to really grasp and understand all of it. But I have confidence that they will be able to bring this big change. And I've seen the big changes even at Xiamen University. It's hard to imagine what can be done with just a dream. When I went to Xiamen University, they asked me to teach business. I refused, but they said, we're going to build one of the top 10 MBA programs in China. They hadn't even, it was one of the first. And I kind of laughed. I said, this little university on an island, I see Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, but Xiamen. But they did. Now we have top 10 MBA and EMBA, and my one MBA program was number 3 in China last year in this category. So I'm amazed at the quality, but one thing that's concerned me is Chinese universities rank lower than foreign universities. It's improving. If you are rich, you can offer a lot more opportunities for research and all these things that Chinese students want. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing, interests me. I love science, especially physics, and so I keep track of the science updates in a lot of different fields. And it's amazing when you look at the research being done in universities in the United States or in Europe, you look at these research teams, almost all of them have Chinese students on the teams. Mm-hmm. And where were they educated? In Chinese mainland. They got their education in Chinese mainland. And very smart people to be on these teams, and many of them are leading these teams in Berkeley and Harvard and Yale and these different universities. So that shows that Chinese education really is very good already. But China doesn't yet have the money that these Western universities have. So I think that as China develops economically, it does have the money now. It's getting more money now. And so I expect Chinese mainland universities to surpass those in other countries, and already do surpass some in some areas. So it's inevitable as China develops economically.
Let's look into the future. What's your plan after retirement? Even though I know you're doing so great at teaching and also writing books, any future plans to work on, especially regarding to the education sector?
I don't plan to retire until I have to. They said I had to retire at 60, and then they extended it to 63, and then they asked me could I teach to 68, and now they told me 2 more years to 70, but I hope at 70 they'll let me go another 30 years. I love teaching.
Another 30 years?
Hope so, I don't know. But I love teaching, and to me it's like the fountain of youth. I love being with students, I love teaching them, but I think I learn more from them than I teach them because life is always changing. I'm glad they don't charge me tuition. If I do retire, one thing is I'm staying in China. This is home. I'm staying in China until I leave the planet. But if I do retire, I'll keep doing the same thing. I can still continue to teach, just not as a full-time professor, and continue to write books. If it wasn't for Xi Jinping hooking me on writing books, I probably wouldn't, but now I'm just so fascinated with the more I learn about China. I've published the past 3 years some books published overseas about the development and history. I want to keep writing. So I'm just going to keep doing what I do until I can't do it.
Lastly, Professor, on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, what are your wishes for the country and its people?
Well, first I want to say I'm very honored that I could have been here in China for more than half of that. 38 years, over half of the 75 years, and see such amazing changes. And my wishes for China for the next 75 years is that it will continue, as it has the past 75, to continue to build methodically, systematically, peacefully upon the foundation that 75 years of people have sacrificed for. I think this will be a great thing for the Chinese people, but also for the rest of the world.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown.
Ever wondered what's actually going on in Africa through the perspective of an African? How are things really going between China and Africa? What's the narrative of this relationship? Well, get a perspective with China-Africa Talk. Hear from African diplomats, entrepreneurs, academics, Chinese natives, and more. Get on our wavelength every week to find out what's real with China-Africa Talk. Find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, and more. We'll see you there.
Sideline Story brings you all things sports related. The hottest topics, latest events, juiciest stories, all with a very personal take. Subscribe to Sideline Story Podcast for heated sports discussions covering events that are happening in China and around the world.
The
best military commander is not he who fights 100 battles and wins every one of them. The best military strategy does not lead to the desiccation of the enemy's capital city. Decoding the art of war will help you understand why there's no art in war and how Sun Tzu stayed undefeatable using the science of war, with fun stories and insightful breakdown of famous battles. Find Decoding the Art of War wherever you listen.